So good morning. Thanks for coming to the IT Pro Track. Just going to do a quick few announcements. This is our Twitter hashtag for the IT Pro Track, so ISC admin. Feel free to push any questions and so on out to this thing, whatever it is, and we will address the questions in the wrap-up on Wednesday. I'll also just spend a few minutes introducing the rest of the IT Pro team. Obviously, they're not on stage right now, but you'll see them over the course of the next 3 days. We have Neil Hodgkinson, who's a senior service engineer with Office 365. He'll be joining us later today. Ben Curry, SharePoint MVP with Summit 7 Systems. Again, he'll be on after lunch. Then we have Todd Carter, SharePoint architect and also an MCM for SharePoint 2010 and 2007. Wayne Ewington, all the way from New Zealand, is down the front here. He's principal consultant with Microsoft Consulting in New Zealand, obviously, and is an MCM and also an MCA. In fact, this conference we have 4 of the 5 MCAs worldwide speaking, so you can ask them all the difficult questions. Not me, the other guys. Then we have Kim O'Fors, who will be joining us later today as well, late this afternoon. He's an architect with MCS based in Finland, also an MCA and MCM. And we've got me. I don't really do anything. I'm just here to try and keep things moving along. And then I'll let these 2 fine gentlemen introduce themselves. Oh, I missed a few people. Sorry. Yeah, Steve. You've already seen him. He doesn't really matter. He's just, and then I'll let these guys introduce themselves. So.
Yeah. How's it going, guys? Chan from New Zealand as well, just like Wayne. And we won the Rugby World Cup. Anybody know that? So, yeah, I work with a company called KnowledgeQ back in New Zealand, doing IT Pro stuff and SharePoint-y things. That's me.
My name is Gary Lapointe. I'm a SharePoint MVP. I work for a company called Aptalon. It's my website and email address. I've also got a book that I wrote that is kind of the subject of this talk and the next 2. So I got a couple copies here we'll be giving away at some point. So again, this talk and the next talk are kind of centered around a lot of what that book covers. So anything I don't go over, or there'll be some things we'll touch upon or whatnot, I go into a lot more detail in the book. So if you have any questions or anything you want to dig deeper on, the book's a great aid for that.
Okay, so our agenda for this first session, and indeed the part 2, which is after the break, is to look just briefly at how we're going to approach the scripting of the build of a brand new farm over on the right-hand side, and then over the course of the 2 sessions, the configuration of the web applications, the service applications, and so on and so forth. So in this session, we'll look at the creation of the farm, joining machines to the farm, creating some web apps and a few site collections as well. And whilst the scripts are running, we'll drop back into the kind of why we've decided to build the environment the way we have. We'll look at the logical architecture and so on, and cover some of the, get rid of that. Sorry about that. Some of the constraints that have driven us to make some decisions. Obviously, in the 3 days, there's only so much we can achieve, so we've had to make some compromises there. And of course, part 2, get into more details on the service applications themselves. So before we dive into the demonstration, which will be the majority of the session, I just want to speak a little bit about why we've chosen PowerShell in this instance. And just for my benefit, or our benefit, a show of hands, how many of you are building your farms today with PowerShell? Okay, most of you. That's pretty good. So I don't want to spend too long on this, but there's really 2 key reasons why you would choose to do it. The first one is for automation purposes. We want to be able to continually stamp out environments using a familiar model and be able to do that in a reliable, repeatable, and consistent fashion. It also reduces, to a large degree, the number of errors that you can make if you're pointing and clicking around in central admin and so on. So that's really the main reasons why we've gone for this approach. And it also, of course, is going to enable us to do this in the time that we have. So it's way quicker to do it this way. And we can do this in a couple of hours, hopefully, fingers crossed. You guys got anything to add on this one?
Yeah, there's a lot of prep work that goes into actually being able to build your farms using PowerShell. Some of these scripts can get fairly lengthy. So just like in the development side, if you're going to push code to production, you need to treat your scripts in a similar fashion. There's a lot of iteration you need to go through to make sure that what your scripts are building is what you actually expect. So don't expect to just sit down one day and crank out a bunch of PowerShell scripts and now you've got a farm going. It takes some time and effort. But as Spence said, the benefits of being able to take the same scripts, build my production, test, dev environments, multiple farms, and I know they're configured in the exact same way across those environments, can save you tons of time and issues, especially when you're looking at your developers and how they're going to deploy things between different environments. You want to make sure that if I'm testing in dev and when I go to test and then production, that I'm not going to encounter new issues and new errors and that kind of stuff. And then the PowerShell as well is if you do it right, it can help you enforce some best practices and whatnot.
Cool. Okay, so this is our basic farm design on the hardware environment that we have. Now, I haven't put all the machines on here. We've got other machines that we'll work with later on when it comes to things like the cloud integration and so on. But we have obviously a domain controller, a couple of SQL servers, and we're going to be using the SQL 01 machine for the majority of this morning's sessions, and then the following two sessions we'll talk about how we split databases across different instances and so on. And there's effectively 6 SharePoint machines. So 2 web servers, which will be running our web application service and workflow and those kind of things. 2 application servers, which are down the bottom there, 3 and 4, which will effectively be hosting all of the non-search related service instances, and then a couple of machines for search, which Neil will get to in his session. So this is what we're effectively going to create now in over these next 2 sessions, is build out this environment.
I think we're going to use the SPO3 server as the first server that we're going to be working on.
Correct, right? Yeah. Well, that'll be the first one we touch, will be the SPO3. And Gary will go into the why for that in a little bit. So a fairly simple environment, but it's enough. It's kind of the bare minimum number of machines we need to be able to show all the things we want to show over the course of the conference.
So the way I'm going to approach scripting this, the natural sort of thought is, let's do the first SharePoint server, SPO1 first. I'm not going to do that. Reason being is that there's some complications with the user profile service. So particularly in the terms of me being able to present a demo, I'm going to build in this session SPO3 first. That's one of our primary app servers. And we're going to provision the web applications on that server. And some of the service applications will get provisioned in this session during the script. During the next session, I've got a script that's going to run using remote in, and I'm going to provision the remaining 5 servers in one go. So we'll do just the one server during this session and then hit all the remaining 5 servers in the next. With the user profile service, there's issues when you start dealing with remote in. It doesn't want to start the sync service. There's some complications there. So it's easier to just remote right into the box, and I'm just going to RDP into SPO3. And then I've got a main controller script, which then calls a bunch of other scripts. So the one sort of block here you've got is just my configure server .ps1 script. That's going to call out to, there's, I don't know, somewhere around a dozen or so other scripts that it's going to run to do things like the web application, site collections, and then all the various service applications. And then each of those scripts is fed by an XML file. So what I don't like to do is put a bunch of variables in my script files that I have to constantly change. I want my script files to be static. So as I use them between different environments, my scripts themselves never change. I'm only changing the XML configuration. That way I'm not having to retest my script. So generally, if I'm having to make changes to a script, I go through the same kind of regression testing that I would any other development code that I'm pushing to production. I treat my scripts just like they are production code that I'm deploying through different life cycles. So this way, if I'm just changing the XML and the variables, I know my scripts aren't changing. It's a little less risk and impact as you're moving between environments.
Okay, so we've done some prep work on the machines already. We've created the Windows environment ahead of time and installed things like SQL Server and so on. Obviously, there's no point showing all of that stuff. And some of the things we've done really for the purposes of RE, so that first bullet there where we've disabled user account control, we've disabled the Windows firewall, we've turned off the Internet Explorer security configuration. This is just generally to make our lives easier. It's not a recommendation that you do this, but if we're fighting these things as we go through, that's soaking up time that we don't have. So that's why we've turned those things off. We've also configured the machines for PowerShell remoting, and we've updated our environment so that whenever we run a PowerShell session, we've already got the Microsoft SharePoint PowerShell snap-in loaded, so we don't have to do that each time we run a script or session.
Right, and the remoting stuff is primarily for the next session where I'll be able to use that. I'm not going to get into how to configure remoting, but if we have some time, I'll show a couple commands that you can use for that. It's pretty simple. The set execution policy, by default, it doesn't, Windows basically doesn't allow the execution of scripts. So we've actually configured it to unrestricted to allow me to run scripts from a share and whatnot. And then, yeah, the profile.ps1 is just a simple little script that gets run every time you open up any editor. So I just didn't want to be tied to the SharePoint 2010 management shell. So this way, as we're doing our demos, both in this session as well as follow-on sessions, we can use any editor. It doesn't matter, and we don't have to worry about is that snap-in loaded.
So we're going to use an an AD account called SP install to do all of the work in these two sessions. That guy is a local machine administrator on all of the machines that are going to be a member of the farm, and it obviously has the required permissions on SQL Server as well, so DB creator and security admin. We've also used SQL aliases for the connections to the SQL servers. We actually have 4 SQL instances across 2 machines. So we're using SQL aliases for those, and the SQL sessions will cover that in more detail. And we've obviously configured some DNS entries for things like the web applications and so on. So we won't show these things, but we'll obviously be building on top of them as we go through the rest of the material.
There's
right
a few
now, the
reasons.
SQL aliases, there's just the one that's
Yeah.
been added for the one server, and we'll add the additional aliases in the follow-on sessions.
There's the reasons that we actually use aliases there as well, because when you try to do management of it, it's best practice as well to use the SQL alias for when you're doing an install. And around the account stuff as well, when you're doing the install, make sure you've got your service accounts created as you need them.
Yeah, we've already got a bunch of different accounts created, and we can perhaps show that whilst it's running, where we've got dedicated accounts for all the different service instances. It's not a least privilege install, but it's a configuration where we're running everything in dedicated accounts for the purposes of configuring all of the services.
And the way the scripts are written, we can basically specify a different account for everything. So different web application pools, service application pools, or whatever. But for example, with the web application pools and service application pools, we're using 2 separate accounts. One for just the content web applications and one for the services. We could have used multiples if we needed to, but in this case, we chose not to. So.
Okay.
All right. So this is the point now where
everything goes
we
wrong.
do some finger crossing. And so let me first just show you what some of these scripts look like before I actually kick them off. You have to forgive me a little bit. I'm not used to the UK keyboard, so if I start messing up some keystrokes here and doing some things wrong, it's either the jet lag or that. So this here is my configure server.ps1 script. It's my main controller script, and all it's going to do is just call a whole mess of other scripts. So I have a little parameter here that I'm passing in that basically tells me, am I connecting to an existing farm or not? So if I provide this switch parameter, I know I'm connecting to an existing farm. If I omit it, then I'm going to create a new farm. Ooh. All right. Scroll down a little bit here. The first script I'm going to call is in this farm creation folder. It's called build spfarm.ps1. I'm going to show that in a little bit later. And it's basically just going to load some functions in memory, which I then call down here. And then the rest here, this is as far as we'll go for this session. We're now basically provisioning the web applications. Again, just calling an existing script that's going to do that. The web applications you do just once in the farm, and it's going to push everything out. So this bit of code won't get called at all in the second session that we do. It's only going to call the service application. So all this down here is all my service application stuff. So again, I'm loading my script into memory and then calling a function that I create. I could have made the scripts so that just loading it executes it, but I don't like doing that because sometimes you go and you double click a script file thinking it's going to edit it, or you say open thinking it's going to open it in the editor and it's actually executing it. So my scripts, generally I design them so that you have to run a function. Loading it in memory is not going to do anything. And that avoids somebody from inadvertently running the script when they think they're just opening it in an editor. In reality, it's going to try to execute it. So not much else to see there, just a bunch of calls to other script files. And in here, this guy here is what's actually going to build our farm. So this is the first thing that's going to get run. And I'm going to walk through this later, so I'm not going to show it right now. But I do want to show the XML file that is driving it. So all of the scripts follow the same general pattern, where there's an XML file that is providing all the variables and everything for that script. I could have made just one single XML file and then fed it into all of them, and the way the XML structure is, it would technically support that. But the way I've set these scripts up is I wanted every script to be independent. So the XML file and the script itself are standalone. So as I'm going through the scripts between the two sessions, you'll see some functions and stuff that I've duplicated between the scripts. Normally I would put that in a shared library, but I didn't want to have to be toggling back and forth between different scripts. I wanted, as I'm demoing or showing you guys these scripts, I wanted to be able to have everything in one place. All right. So I've opened up just the standard PowerShell console window here. And again, our profile is loading the snap-ins, and you can see local farm is not accessible. If I tried to come into the central admin site here, it's going to open the configuration wizard. So, yeah, so it hasn't been created. You want to watch the configuration wizard? No, I don't. So nothing. Here it's just a plain old server. See, the backslash key on my keyboard is over here. On this keyboard, it's over here.
You get used to it by Wednesday.
I knew I was going to do that too. All right, so. Okay. It didn't bomb right off the bat. So it's already going ahead and creating the farm. The error that you see in right here, this is actually because we have the Office web applications installed. And sometimes when you install the Office web applications, it basically sets a registry key that says that the thing needs to be upgraded. So you'll see this in the script. I'll talk about it a little bit more, but we want to basically run psconfig to effectively clear that switch, and that generates this output that you're seeing on the screen here. So it's basically kind of just ignore it, but we need to do that in order to get past the registry key issue. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah.
All right, so while that's running, we're going to switch back to our deck.
Yeah, so just whilst the script is kicking off, it takes a little while. I'm just going to talk through some of the topology choices we've made. Now, in terms of the end, this is in terms of the end result, right? So the environment that we will have by the point at the end of the second session. So as I mentioned, the first two machines, SP1 and 2, are going to host the web application service, SharePoint Foundation workflow, the sandbox service, which unfortunately we need to support the business requirements from all those people in the other room. They're going to give us something that allegedly works in the sandbox, so that's what that guy's for. Incoming email, central admin, and search query as well. So that, you know, both of those machines are identical in terms of their configuration there. And then on the 3 and 4, the servers SP3 and 4, we have most of our service application related service instances. So these are the ones that we've chosen. So managed metadata, business connectivity, secure store, the Office web apps, word automation, and then the usage claims to Windows token service, should really have written that out, and web analytics are effectively prerequisites for the farm to operate. And then we have, of course, user profile. And because we can only have the user profile sync service instance on a single machine for a user profile service application, we've just got that on SP3. As Gary was mentioning, that's the one that kind of causes us the problems with remoting. And then later on, Neil will walk through will expand out the search roles, so search, crawl, and query across the 2 additional machines as well. So we'll have a highly available search topology as opposed to a not very available one that we have initially. So these service applications that we've got here, obviously it isn't all of them. There's quite a few missing. These are the ones that the developers are building a solution which requires all of these things, okay? With the exception of the Office web apps, but that we wanted to show some other elements of that in the IT Pro track. So they're going to make use of things like word automation, BCS, and managed metadata. And we also need user profiles as well for some of those things. So that's why these are the ones that we've chosen. We haven't deployed, you know, Power Pivot and those other aspects that we could have done, mainly because we don't need those capabilities for the rest of the sessions. So it's a fairly simple topology. How many of you here are doing a 4-server farm with SharePoint 2010? So 4 machines. Okay, how many are you doing more than 4? Okay, good. So that's hopefully going to match expectations there.
So what I want to talk about now is just kind of walk through some of the commandlets that we're using. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time in the slides. I just kind of want to highlight what the commandlets are, and then we'll do a walk through the actual script that we're using to provision the farm and talk about things a little bit more. So when we're creating the farm, there's one key commandlet, new SP configuration database. This is the guy that creates that configuration database. Once you run this, you have a farm. It could be just the one single server, but you basically have a farm there. It can't do anything. There's no web apps, no service apps, no central admin, nothing, but you have a farm. Once you have additional servers and you want to join those servers to the farm, that's the connect SP configuration database. That command that won't run in this session will run in the next one. But again, you'll see that in the main script and how we're using that. So I'll talk about it here in this session, but it doesn't actually get executed till the next one. And then finally, we need to finalize the configuration. So if we look at what happens when I run the SharePoint configuration wizard, what are all the different things that it's doing? Well, besides creating the configuration database on the central admin site and whatnot, it's also setting up some things like the security on registry keys and file system, folders, files, that kind of stuff. So the initialize SP resource security is what does that. You need to run that on every server because it's going to make sure that everything is properly ACL'd. Installing the service, this is basically registering your service instances. So again, this would be another one you would run on every server. It's going to go and take all the binaries and whatnot that are on disk and make sure that they're loaded up. You get your service snap in. You'll see some things loaded there. They're basically already in the snap-in, but you're kind of registering them with SharePoint in the configuration database. So you're telling SharePoint, I have these services, they're on this machine, here's where they are, here's what they are. And then the install SP feature, there's basically a single parameter that you're going to use on this called all existing. You're going to basically tell it to look in the features folder in the 14 Hive, 14 templates features, and it's just going to take every single folder in that features folder and register it with SharePoint. So if you're doing things bad and you're installing custom solutions manually using install SP feature, it's the same thing, except you're just going to tell it to go ahead and run for every feature within that folder. And again, this is something you would do on every server. So the central admin site, it's a pretty simple one called new SP Central Administration. You're going to provide the port that you want, whether or not you want it to use NTLM or Kerberos. I always recommend using NTLM first and then configuring for Kerberos afterwards if you need to use Kerberos for that. So make sure things work before you start messing with Kerberos settings. And then optionally, you can run the install SP help collection and install SP application content. You'll see a lot of scripts where these say these are required. They're not. No, they aren't. They just install some things that you can use within central admin site. There's some content and some help content, but most of the time I don't even run these guys because they're useless. I mean, a lot of the content that it provides doesn't really give you much value. So many of my scripts, I have that in there and I'll run it if I'm provisioned in the central admin site, but you can omit it and you're probably never even going to notice it. All right, so what I want to do now is just walk through the script. So you can see here our script is still running. It's actually created the farm, and it's in the middle of provision in the web applications and its site collections right now. So it just set up some SharePoint designer settings, some security groups, that kind of stuff. So things are working, and hopefully I don't push a button that kills it. All right, so this is the build SP farm script. So this script is actually already finished, and it's moved on to the next one. But here I created two just little helper functions here just to make it more clear in my controller script what I'm doing. Am I joining the farm, or am I creating a new farm? I could have just simply called the one here, this build SP farm, and just specify the values that I'm passing in. But again, I like more explicit names. So this way I could have one script that kind of encompassed everything, but then I have different functions based on intention. So you can see here I'm passing in the XML file, just the path, and if you don't pass that in, I'm going to throw an exception here. So this is within PowerShell. This is a way, a nice simple way where you can do some parameter validation. There are some other ways that you'll see in some of the follow-on scripts that I've got that use more of a commandlet bind-in type stuff, using attributes to do the same thing. And here, so what I'm passing in as my config file is just the path to that file. So I'm using the get content commandlet to just go ahead and get that as XML. And I'm casting that to a system.xml document object. So with PowerShell, I can take a string and I can say, treat this string as an XML document, and it'll figure out how to cast that to that actual type. It's called the adaptive type system. With that now, I can access my elements and attributes using dot notation. So here, I'm saying this is an XML document. So if I look at that structure, so I've got farm as an element, farm account, account password, account name, right? I can come in here and just say config.farm, that's my root element, .farm account, .account password, and that just allows me to drill right down into those elements. So this is one reason why I like to use XML, is it's really easy to navigate that XML to pull variables out. So with this here, I'm just trying to figure out, okay, what is my farm account that I'm trying to use? And with that, what is the farm account password that I'm going to use, or farm passphrase, rather, that I'm going to use to allow me to join additional servers. If for some reason this was omitted, the farm passphrase, I'm just defaulting to the farm account. So we've got a really nice secure password here, right? Best practice real world, don't put your passwords in scripts. We're doing it here so that I don't have to keep going and keying in the password every 2 minutes, so that we can have the script running in the background. And we're using a very insecure password here because of different keyboard layouts. We got a lot of us from different places, and we don't want to have to be basically locking our passwords for each other. So we chose a very nice simple password to use. For the passphrase though, you can't use a simple password like that. It's going to balk at you. So. All right, so as we get through here, main thing I wanted to show, so this is what I was talking about here as far as the PS config, because we have the Outlook, Office web applications installed. We basically just need to clear that registry. So we'd actually pre-run this command on the server, so technically I didn't need this in the script, but I wanted to show it here because it trips a lot of people up when they're doing scripts, because they're wondering why it's saying I need to upgrade when I've got a clean install. It's just because the Office web apps are messing with you. And before I show the commandlets, one other thing I want to point out. Okay, so it popped up this window here because it's doing the user profile sync service. So we're moving through. It's already finished the web applications and is now moving on to the service apps, which is next session. But, so some of you that have been working with PowerShell already know there's a commandlet called get_spfarm that can retrieve my farm object. It's a great way to tell whether or not your farm has been created or not. Except there's no way to say, okay, well, if it isn't there, don't error out. So I can put get_spfarm, error action, silently continue. Yeah, it completely ignores that error action, and it just bombs. So I have to use the static spfarm.local to figure out whether my farm actually exists or not. So this is just a check that I have to make sure that I'm not trying to recreate the farm when I already have a farm. So this basically comes down to resiliency. Make your scripts work so that you can run them multiple times so that during your testing and whatnot, you don't want to have to keep doing or having it try to execute the same task over and over again. Because now, if you're trying to test something later in the script and an earlier part fails because it's already there, you're going to run into a lot of trouble. So, all right, so the key point here is this commandlet here can connect to SP configuration database and new SP configuration database. So again, I'm just passing in variables and I'm pulling out from the XML file. And you'll see these little ticks here. This is just the new line escape character for PowerShell. So my scripts, that way I can wrap my parameters, makes it a little easier to read. So it's just a backward tick. I am setting failover databases here, but I'm not going to talk about that because that's a later session. And actually, if we look at our XML, I have that just emptied out here, so I'm not setting it. But I do have code that could set it ahead of time if we knew that. But in this session, we don't know about those failover databases yet. So at this point now, it's created the farm or joined to it. Now I can run my get SP farm and validate that it did, in fact, create it. So if this guy comes back and is null, or if I get some sort of error there, then something went wrong, and it'll just bug out. And the rest here is just calling those additional commandlets that I talked about. Now this piece here, once I created the farm, I don't know if you, I can't go back to it right now, but when I originally had that command window open, I don't know if you saw there was a little error that said the local farm doesn't exist. Some features with feature dependencies may not be available, or some commandlets rather with feature dependencies may not be available. There's certain commandlets, such as the Excel services commandlets, that have dependencies on features being installed in the farm. So if I'm going and loading a PowerShell window and I load that snap in, those commandlets, the Excel service commandlets, for instance, are not going to be available to me. But now I've gone ahead and created my farm, and I'm going to go and provision those service applications in the same PowerShell instance. I need to go ahead and remove the snap-in and add it back in so that those commandlets get registered properly. When I'm doing remote-in, this is actually going to cause an error, but it's a non-fatal error. It's because remote-in doesn't properly unregister the types. So we're going to see a whole mess of red in the next session when we do that. You can just ignore that, but I'll talk about that more then. And then finally here, just in case the timer service is not running, I go ahead and start that up. And then I go ahead and kick off the creation of the central admin site. So if I look in my XML, here I'm defining what servers do I want central admin on. So we're kind of temporarily doing it on 3. Eventually, we may turn that off because we really only want it on 1 and 2. But I would need it on 3 so I can show you guys something actually worked. So we're going to go ahead and provision the central admin site, and we're just going to use NTLM for that. And again, I have some checks in here to make sure, am I installing it? Have I already installed it? So don't do it again if I don't need to. And I'm only dealing with the install SP help collection and install SP application content if I'm going to install that central admin site. Now again, this one technically, I'm provisioning central admin on 3 different servers. I only need to run this once for the first one, but it doesn't hurt to run it for each one. So it's not worth it for me to add a bunch of logic in here to figure out, have I already run this guy? It's a waste of time. So just run it again. It's not going to hurt anything. And then finally, I'm setting some outgoing email settings. And I'm not going to talk about this right now, but there's a couple services that we are turning on and off in this script because they're very, very simple in terms of a code standpoint. So it didn't make sense to abstract those out into other scripts. Things like the workflow timer service, income and email, and the web application service. So on this server, if I look at my XML, and see the service application, the services that we've got. So this is the web application service. We're only running that on 2 servers, 1 and 2. So after we provisioned 3, even though this talk is about creating the web applications, we're going to have web applications, but I'm going to have no way to browse to them because the web application service will be turned off as part of this configuration. So we'll be able to see it through PowerShell that they exist, but if I try to open it up in the browser, we can see in IIS that there's not going to be anything there. And let's see. And the rest here is just setting permissions on that. So this stuff, the script and whatnot, I'm going to show in the next session. So that is the end of that one.
So I just want to talk a little bit about the logical architecture. You're not supposed to be able to read this diagram. I can't read it. I have to come over here and peer at it. But what we're going to focus in on is this bit in the middle. These are the web applications. So I've expanded these out. You probably can't read them either, but they're slightly bigger. So this is our logical architecture that we've designed to support all of the business requirements for both, this track and the development track as well. So the main one we're interested in is this guy in the middle, which is the intranet. So we've got a URL there of intranet.isclondon.local with a couple of managed paths off the end of that. The first one is just a regular sites wildcard managed path for all of the site collections that our business needs. And then we have a content type hub as well for the managed metadata service. We're going to use claims authentication for this guy, and otherwise it's fairly straightforward. We're going to use the regular team site template for this web application. Then on the right-hand side, we've got a couple more. At the top, we've got the My Sites web application. That's obviously where our My Site site collections will be created. And then at the bottom, we have a team web application, which is for collaboration sites. And again, that's just using the standard sites wildcard managed path. And we don't actually, and we're doing claims on that one as well. We're doing classic on the My Sites. And the reason for that will come out in the user profile session. So it's a fairly simple environment, and it probably looks very familiar to many of you. We don't need anything other than this. On the far left, we've just got central admin and a couple of the core services in the farm that we need. So the security token service and the topology service down the bottom here. But this is really what we are, these are the free web applications that are being created right now, which we will use for the rest of the sessions this week. These diagrams, by the way, will be made available in, full format size later in the week for those who are interested. Oops.
We get to 10:45?
Yeah.
All right, so now I want to start going through and talking about how are we going to build the web applications, the commandlets involved and whatnot. And this is where we're going to start seeing more code snippets. So I'm going to talk about the application pools, the web applications, and the site collections. I'll show you some little snippets here. And then again, I'll walk through the provisioning script. And those scripts, the ones that I'm showing through the demos today and tomorrow, just today actually, will be available. I'm going to have a blog post I'll put up, so I'll make the ones that I'm showing available. So as far as the application pools, it's a little bit confusing actually as far as how you use an existing application pool versus create a new one and whatnot, because they didn't really expose any specific commandlets. Like there's no getsp web application pool commandlet. There is a getsp service application pool commandlet, but you don't want to use those application pools for your web applications. They serve completely different purposes, and you really don't want any kind of crossover there. I don't know if you want to talk any more about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly the design model is that the service application pools are only for hosting the endpoints of service applications. They've got vastly different resource requirements to those which would host a web app. So it's not really, it's not just a question of sort of getting them mixed up, causing confusion. It'll actually have pretty drastic impact on your farm's health and performance if you run a web application inside a service application pool. So yeah, you should always host web apps in web application pools.
Right. So your service applications, when you create in those, there is an application pool pipe bind object. So basically I can pass in actually it's not a pipe bind object in this case, but I can pass in an application pool object. So I got to get it first and then I pass it in. With the web applications, there's really no option there. I give it a string name if I want to use an existing one. If I want to create a new one, I give it the string name for the application pool parameter, and I also need to specify the account that I want to use. What I would have liked ideally from the Microsoft team is a separate set of commandlets for managing application pools and then pass in an actual application pool object. That way it's very explicit from a scripting standpoint that I'm using an existing one. In this case though, fortunately the application pool account parameter, I can pass in a null or empty value and it'll treat that as I want to use an existing one. The trick is making sure that that is in fact your intent. And this gets down into how we deal with optional parameters in PowerShell. Some of them are pretty easy like that. I can pass in an empty variable, and I don't have to put a bunch of if-else conditions in my, my code to deal with the different ways of calling the commandlets. And I'll talk about another technique there that's a little bit better. But there's tons of inconsistencies within the product in terms of how you use the commandlets, especially when it comes down to optional or required parameters. When it comes to creating a new application pool, again, you're going to provide the application pool parameter, and you're going to set the application pool account parameter to an SP managed account. So here's some code that will actually do that. The key line here is highlighted. This is what you're going to use to determine whether or not you're looking at an existing commandlet. Did I already create this guy? So here in my script, I'm setting some variables. I'm getting what the pool name is, what the account name is that I want to use. In this case, the password I know is in the script. Again, typically, you wouldn't put that in your config. You'd use a get credential here and pull that password out of the, actually, you don't technically need the password. You just need the get credential, the SP credential object that's created. And then I'm creating a variable called pool account and just setting that to null. So that line that's highlighted, this is what I'm doing to determine whether or not I have an existing pool, an application pool. So again, there is no get SP web application commandlet, so I have to go into the content service object and use the application pool static property. This is going to give me a collection. From there, I'm looking within that collection and saying basically, if I find an application pool whose name is equal to the pool name that's specified in my configuration file, then great, I have an existing pool, use that, pass that on to the code that's going to create the web application. If I don't have anything, so if that check comes back as null, then I know I need to go ahead and create that application pool. So all I'm doing here is setting up the account. So if I need to create the application pool, that means I need to get the account information. If I have one, I don't need to worry about the account information. That's already set. I can ignore the account variables. So all the rest of that code was just to handle creating a new managed account object. So I'm passing in the account name, and then I'm getting a SP managed account, checking to see if that account already exists. If it doesn't exist, then I'm creating one. And again here, because I already have the password, I'm manually creating a PS credential object and passing in the username and password. Typically, real world, you would just do the get credential command and bring back an actual PS credential object that way, so user provided. So in terms of creating the web application, there's some decisions you need to make. Is it going to be a classic, or are you going to use claims or forms, so your authentication mechanisms and whatnot? If you're going to use claims or forms, there's a little bit more work you need to do in terms of setting up your authentication providers. With Classic, it's really simple. You don't need to worry about it. You just provide parameters on the new SP web application commandlet that you're going to call. It's not a whole lot that you need to worry about for, excuse me, for the authentication. But if you're going to use claims or forms, there's an additional step you need to take before you create the web application, and that's to set up your authentication providers. And you do that using the new SP authentication provider commandlet. If you need to use more than one thing, you can create an array. So here I've got a variable called AP, and I'm initializing it to @ open paren, close paren. That just creates an array, and now I can append as many authentication provider calls as I want to that using just the plus equal sign. So here, like I said, I'm not providing any variables here, but if I've got multiple providers I need to provide, I can have each one on a separate line. That'll create a variable, and I pass that variable into the authentication provider's parameter on the web application. With the web application itself, again, I want to check, does this guy already exist? Don't create it if it's there. Create the web application using the new SP web application commandlet, and then there's some additional properties that I can set using set SP web application. Once I have the web application created, I can go ahead and set up the managed paths. So again, do my paths exist? So get SP managed path, and then create it, new SP managed path. And then if I need to add any additional content databases. So I think in our structure, we just have the one content database, right?
Yep.
So in this case, I'm not going to be creating any new content databases, but the new SP content database commandlet would be what you would use for that. And I think in my code, and I'll show you the XML structure, I have it set up so that I could easily in XML just provide any number of content databases, and those content databases in the XML will contain the site collections. Well, the code will go ahead and provision those content databases for us. So again, the scripts accommodate multiple content databases. In this case, we're only using the one. And here's some code to do both of those. So the first one, again, the managed paths. I basically got to go and I'm looking at my managed paths element within the XML, make sure I even have an element there. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab the managed paths, or loop through rather each one of those elements. So that for each sign there, I'm looping through my XML file, looping through each definition. And then I'm calling getSPManagedPath to determine whether or not that path already exists for the given web application. And if it doesn't, I'm calling new SPManagedPath to create it. Now, one thing to point out here is you see that line underneath where it's highlighted, explicit, colon, bool, parse. So my XML, it's a string, right? So I have a true false in there, indicate whether it's explicit. So there's two things to mention here. First, I got to convert that string to an actual bool object. PowerShell is a fully typed language. There's some type translation that it'll do. Sometimes it can take a string and convert it to the appropriate type automatically for you. In this case, it can't. So I've got to take that string and tell it to convert it to a Boolean. The next bit is the fact that this is a switch parameter. So typically the way switch parameters work is it's either there or isn't. If it's there, then I'm saying true. If it's not there, false. But you can basically override that behavior by adding a colon and then specifying true or false. So this is great when you're writing scripts where you don't know whether or not that value is present. I don't want to have to write an if-else statement and wrap how I'm calling my commandlet based on the presence of the variable. I just want to be able to explicitly set whether I want that switch parameter to be true or false. And that's how I'm doing that there. As far as the content databases, it's a little bit simpler. Again, I'm looping through my elements within the XML configuration, checking to see if that content database already exists. If it doesn't, we call new SP content database. And here I can specify the name, the web application it's going to go to, the database server. This is where we would use a SQL alias for that. And you'll see in the XML we're using an alias for our database servers. And then the max and warning site counts. And I'll show you this all in context in just a second here. Creating site collections. These commandlets are pretty straightforward. GetSPSite, again, does it already exist? GetSPSite is actually pretty cool. You can do a lot of wildcards. So in terms of what we're going to use here, I want a very explicit URL. I'm going to call GetSPSite and pass in the exact URL that I want. But in terms of just IT admin and working with PowerShell and whatnot, there's a lot you can do with wildcards and some other things to return back a subset of site collections and then do some bulk operations on them. So definitely get familiar with that commandlet and what you can do with it. New SPSite, I can now go ahead and create that site collection. So splatting. So consider the scenario where you've got an optional parameter and passing in a value for that parameter, a null or empty value, is an error. So basically the commandlet is configured in such a way that null or empty is bad, it's going to throw an error. But the parameter is required. So what the product team is basically looking for is if it's optional, then the command shouldn't be there. The parameter shouldn't be there at all, which is great when you're in the command line, right? I'm either going to provide that or not. But when I'm in a script, I don't know how my XML file, my configuration file, whatever, variables, however you set up that information, has been declared. So if you've got a scenario where I have 4 optional parameters on there, and they're all configured to throw errors on empty or null, then I have 2 options. One is to write if-else statements to cover all scenarios. So you get 12 if-else blocks to cover those 4 optional parameters now, right, if you do the math, right? The other option is this technique called splatting. And what that allows me to do is create a hash table of key value pairs. So I'm going to create a key, which is my parameter name, and then the value that I want to pass into it. And then I'm going to pass that in to my commandlet. This avoids all these different if-else conditions. I can do an if and determine whether or not the parameter value is empty or not. And if it's not empty, just append it to that hash table. So here's an example of how to do that. So I have a variable called optional parameters, and I'm instantiating that as a hash table. The way you do that in PowerShell, @, open curly brace, close curly brace. I have a hash table now. Now I can go ahead and append to that hash table. So I'm looking to see if my secondary login is empty or not. If it is not empty, so string is null or empty. If it's not empty, I'm going to create a new hash table. And this time, instead of creating an empty hash table, I'm going to create a hash table with one record in it. Secondary owner alias is the key. Secondary login is the value from that XML variable is going to be the value there. And the plus equal is just appending it to it. So I can basically take this hash table and just keep adding additional hash tables to it. And it just builds it up as a single hash table with multiple rows. I then take that hash table and I can pass that in to my new SB site commandlet call. So here you'll see I'm providing all my required and known parameters, the ones that I want to specify here. But then at the very end, after it says error action continue, I'm providing those optional parameters. The difference here is instead of doing dollar optional parameters, I'm doing @ optional parameters. And this is how PowerShell knows, oh, you want me to use what's in this hash table as parameter key values. Right, so it's going to loop through that and say, for each parameter, set the value. So it's a great way to build up your parameters. And it's also one way that we do things for like provision in the user profile service and getting things into the start job commandlet if you're running without UAC and you can use start job. But that's a topic for another session. All right. So let me walk through that.
Something worked next door. It only took him an hour.
That's right. Okay, so this is the provision web application script that went ahead and provisioned our web applications, oddly enough. It also handled the site collections. So in the scripts that I use for personal use, I actually have the site collection provision in as a separate one, but just so I'm not, again, toggling back, I made this into a single script. So here you can see also some documentation. So this is how you do documentation within PowerShell. It's a little bit cryptic in terms of the syntax. But again, if you're providing scripts that you're going to maintain and potentially hand off to somebody else, so if you're a developer writing these scripts to give to an IT pro, you want these comments in there so that you understand how am I supposed to call this guy, what is expected, that kind of stuff. So from your perspective, if you're not really the PowerShell guy and you've got a PowerShell person or developer that's going to put these together, make sure they add some sort of comments like this so you understand how are you supposed to use these things. And now I can do basically, I can load this into memory and I can type help provision web applications and it'll give me the syntax as well. So that way if you're loading it through a profile or something like that, you don't always have to load the script itself. And this is what I was talking about in terms of, you can see it better on there, it's syntax highlighting. It's not ideal. Let me do this. All right, so that's not really any better. So apologies on the color here, but there's an attribute here called commandlet binding. So this is basically telling me that I want to treat the script file as though it were a compiled commandlet, only in the sense of how it handles the parameters. So now I can come in here and add additional attributes. So rather than doing the throw statement in there like I did on the other example, here I've got an attribute called validate. I can't even read it on here. Validate not null. If that's there, PowerShell is just going to say, okay, if this parameter is not provided, then throw an error. If they provided it, and sorry, actually, this one is what it says. If it's not there, throw an error. If they provided it, but they provided a null value, then throw an error. So this way, I avoid a lot of additional code to deal with error handling of those parameters. So this bit here, so this is my main entry point. At this point, I'm in here. Now I'm just looking at the parameter set. So how do they call this guy? And I'm adjusting the call and calling back to myself to make sure that basically what I want is an XML configuration representing the web application. So if we look at that actual web application XML. So here I got the farm, my web applications element, and then the actual web application itself. So we're defining the name, our host header, port, time zone, path we want it to go to, what our load balanced URL is, so a ton of different options here that we're specifying. My portal super user, cache account kind of stuff, application pool, our managed paths, user policies. So we're not even going to show all of this, but you can see it's dealing with a lot of stuff in terms of just getting that web application set up. And then we get our content database. I can have multiple content database elements in there, multiple site collections, and it's just going to iterate through these guys. So by doing it with XML, my script that creates a site collection, for instance, I'd wrap that in a loop, and now I can create 10 site collections. All I have to do is define them here in the XML. So a lot of this code is kind of set up. So right now I'm going through and just pulling out some variables. So I first check to see whether or not that web application already exists. So I'm just pulling that web application in here again. Error action silently continue. That way, if it doesn't exist, I don't want to throw in an error. I just want a null object, and that way I can check for null. If it doesn't exist, I'm going to go ahead and create it. And all of this code is just setting up my variables. Just making sure, do I have a content database that's defined in there? My anonymous and SSL permissions, just pulling those out, just to make the call to the command itself a little bit easier. And then I can add any additional validation if necessary. And then here, this is the same code we looked at earlier as far as getting my application pool account. So there's nothing different there. Getting my load balance URLs, making sure those are valid. I want to make sure that there's not a conflict between what's specified for SSL versus the schema on the load balance URL versus the host header, that kind of stuff. So I do just a little bit of testing there to make sure I've got good data. My authentication mode here, if it's claims, I've got some work to do in terms of setting up the authentication provider. So you can see here, I'm creating my new SP authentication provider, passing in those different variables. And again, some validation to make sure that there's not conflicting parameters. And finally, right here, all the way down on line 130, I'm creating the web application. So most of the code before here is really just making sure that my parameters and my input is good. So that way, when I hand this off to somebody, if somebody did a copy and paste error within that XML or something, I've got some recourse in here to basically bail out before I go too far. And keep going here. So this is an example of one additional parameter, the time zone. I can't set when I'm creating it. I have to set that afterwards. There's not a whole lot of options with the set SP web application that aren't available when I'm actually creating the web application itself. If I remember, I think this is actually the only one, which is why it's the only one there. And now one thing I need to do is after I create it, there's often some things that happen in the background. So I need to get it again. And ideally, what I really should have here is a sleep statement. Before I try to get it, sleep for a few seconds to make sure that any of those timer jobs have actually completed. You could get more complex, more fancy than that, trying to figure out what timer jobs are running and are there still updates happening, that kind of stuff. But I find in most of these cases where you're dealing with update conflict issues and timer jobs, just sleep for a few seconds and that usually handles it. And then from there, so now at that point, I'd have a web application. Now I want to go ahead and do some other stuff. So this code here is all about setting up the cached user account. So if you're working with publishing sites, you'll see errors in your event logs if you haven't done this about how the way it's accessing the site is not optimized, and I forget what the actual error says, but basically there's two different accounts that you can configure so that it can properly read and save caching information and whatnot. So all this code is just setting up those accounts, and I have a helper function that I created called set web app user policy, which then goes ahead and grants those accounts the appropriate rights. I'll show you that in just a second. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just kind of blow through this really quick here.
You've got 10 minutes. You've got 10 minutes.
Okay.
So managed paths, this code is the same that I showed on the in the deck. So I'm not going to show that again. And now the content databases, again, so now I'm looping through those content databases, creating that new content database. And then I have some code in here to set the failover stuff. So again, you'll see that in another session. But you can do this in a simpler way, but I'm adding code in here to make sure that it's set properly, that it hasn't already been set, and that kind of stuff. And finally, getting down to the site collections. So again, we're on line 279, so there's a fair amount of code here. So again, I'm looping through my site collection element, grabbing, using the getSPSite commandlet to see if there's an existing one. Again, error action, silently continue. That way, if it doesn't exist, I'm not going to get an error. I just need to know, does it exist or not? And if it does exist, dispose it. So, because I'm done with it, I don't need to use it. So I can just move on to the next one, but I need to free up that memory. So SPSite object consumes unmanaged memory resources. So not a big deal for just one site collection here. I'm building the farm, but I do actually have farms and configurations I built where we've pre-declared several hundred site collections, and we don't want to keep, if I have to run this more than once, I don't want to keep those in memory every time I need to run that. And then again, here's where I'm using that splat-in technique to build up those optional parameters. And then finally calling the new SPSite commandlet and passing those in. And if it comes back and that's null, then I'm going to write a warning out. But I'm not going to, in this case, I'm not going to abort the script. I'm just going to move on to the next one. So otherwise, if it did create it, now here's where we're going to go in and set a couple more things up. So first off, if you create a site collection through the browser, it's going to set up 3 security groups for you, your owners, members, and visitors automatically. If you do it through PowerShell, it does not. So this is a sort of common step that a lot of people forget when they're using PowerShell to provision this thing. If you want the same behavior that I get through the browser, you want to make sure that you call this function. So I'm going to grab my site collection here. I'm going ahead and creating a new instance of it so I don't get conflicts. So I'm passing in the existing SPSite object that I have to getSPSite, and this will give me a new instance of that. And I actually should have a dispose in here. And then I'm going to use that, and on the root web property here, so this gives me the root SPWeb object, there's a method called create default associations. And here, I'm basically just giving it some information. You can actually pass in empty strings for all these, and it'll just use some default information. But I didn't do that. So, but this will make sure that those guys are actually created correctly. Oh, and I did dispose it right down here. Let's see. So I'm okay. I just got to look at my code ahead. That's all. So, all right. That's it for that. And the last thing I wanted to show within here is just this little helper function that I created. So this is just what allows me to set the user policies. So if, again, for like the cache user accounts and whatnot, I need to give the super reader account full read and the super user account full control. Sorry, right? Yeah. So I created a little helper function. I can pass in the web application, so my SP web application object, username, the user's display name, which doesn't really need to be provided, and then what permission am I trying to grant. So read, full control, whatever. And here, I'm going to go ahead now and get the web app policies. And I'm going ahead and casting this to the specific type. I don't really need to do that in PowerShell, but I did it. I usually do it in some of my functions here just so that if people reading it, they know what they're actually getting back. And it helps if you're trying to troubleshoot or look up, what is this thing, what are the methods that are available. And then from there, I'm going ahead and creating, or basically adding a new SP policy object, my username, display name. And from there, I'm adding basically getting the list of policy roles where the name equals the existing permission that I've got. So I'm looking for, in this case, a full control role. So now I have a policy role, and I'm going to use that to create a new binding, which then I'll add to the web application and update it. So, but anyways, it's a simple function, and again, I detail this in the book. probably better than I just did right now. And that's it for that script. Oh, and our last slide is that toggle back. All right, so did this actually work? And yes, it did. So this actually took 17 minutes to run. We've only built the one server, but again, it built the web application, site collections, and all of the service applications that are relevant to this server. So I can scroll back through here and I can see some of the output, and it's really not worth spending time unless most of this is just output from the service applications. After I start the instance, it's output in the service instance information to the screen. In some of my code, I got some to-dos there to do some additional manual sets, that kind of stuff. So that's all that warning code was. But what I'm looking for is up beyond the service application stuff here. All right, so let me just do this. Let's go ahead and now if we open up Central Admin, you see, boom, we have a Central Admin site now. I can come into my web applications. We have our intranet, our My Sites, our team sites. But if we look within IIS here, let me refresh that. We'll see that those web applications don't exist here. This is because we've stopped the web application service on this machine. So if that service were running, if I turn that back on, you'll see those IIS sites pop back up here. And then we got some application pools. And these are going to be specific mainly to the service applications. So some of them the out-of-the-box ones. And then one of these, I'm guessing probably this one. It's hard to tell, but I'll talk about that in the next one. So one of these two are going to be our service application pools. But if I want to validate, beyond Central Admin, did it actually create those web applications? I can do get sp web apps tab key. I can see they're there. So I can't browse to them yet because we don't have that service started, but I'll go ahead and open those up in the next session once we get the other servers added. So that is the scripts, and looks like everything worked. So
leave it alone. Don't touch it for 15 minutes.
Yeah.